Namaste to everybody. So I'm going to start with a couple of mini stories and maybe mini quizzes here. The first one is, this is a personality. His feats consist of the national epic of his country. And not just he, but his epic writer. So the one who wrote this epic about him is also celebrated in his country. So like, we celebrate Valmiki Maharshi for writing Ramayana, not just Rama, but even Valmiki for writing is celebrated. So in the same way, his, the person who chronicled his feats is celebrated. Dance dramas and poetry are written on him. The longest bridge in his country is named after him. His country's navy has his name all over it. His image is on its currency. Even a crater on the moon is named after him. All right, I'm going to go ahead and show you. So this is the currency of his country, Portugal. And you can see this is Vasco da Gama's ship. And here's a depiction of him, his image on this currency. So Vasco da Gama is celebrated as a great hero because he found the route to India, which allowed his country to become prosperous and benefited them immensely. Now, let us look at another story, or again, a mini story. So this is somebody who I would consider my great hero. He has composed 84 works spanning multiple fields: philosophy, grammar, poetry, medicine, astronomy, shipbuilding, civil engineering, yoga, aeronautics, mathematics, veterinary science, poetics, statecraft. And some of his compositions are here. Some of his works are here. And these are not even, just ordinary works. They're very high quality works. So he has done all this. Plus, he routed Ghazni out of India. He rebuilt the Somnath temple. He expelled Mahmud Ghazni's governors. He killed his successor in battle near Ayodhya. And following this complete rout, for at least 150 years, no invader dared look at India. So who is this? This is Raja Bhoja, the great Raja Bhoja. And he was not just a great ruler, warrior, but also a great scholar. Now, our history books will not tell us about either of these people. We have not heard about Raja Bhoja and his greatness. On the other hand, we do not hear either that the Portuguese celebrate the man who simply found a route to India. India was so prosperous, so rich, that even finding a route to get here was something great. Again, we don't hear this. Let us move to something else. What do you see in this map? It seems like there's a new continent or a large island that's emerged in the Pacific Ocean. So this is actually the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. 80,000 tons of garbage in that patch. This is an example of what Western education has taught us to do. To, not live in harmony with nature, to mindlessly plunder and destroy. And we are reaping the effects of that, of course. Here's another example: millions of tons of raw sewage being pumped into the Thames each year. But now you might ask, so was this not happening with other, is it just Western education or civilization that did this? What about us? So here's a verse from the Manusmriti, Vasudha Kita Sarpa Kusandushtodakaha Varsha Jalavaha Nadya Sarva Dosha Samiranaha. So basically, this tells us what it pollutes water and how water should be kept pure and free of these pollutants, rivers and other water bodies. And this is just one example. Multiple works, both in Sanskrit and in other vernacular languages, have several verses devoted to this. Same with Charaka Samhita, some of the Ayurvedic works, as well as many other works, detail what you should do to keep it clean and what you should not do near a source of water. So, for example, any urination or defecation was forbidden near a source of water. But all this was forgotten. And when the British colonized us and brought in their ways of disposing sewage into rivers, we have followed that. And unfortunately, today our rivers, thanks to our larger population, are far more polluted than theirs. I mentioned that it's not just in Sanskrit, but also in the vernacular languages. This is a verse from a Tamil work. And this is really interesting because it says the 5 bhutas, right? The 5 Panchamahabhutas. The world is composed of these Panchamahabhutas. So if you do not take care of the Panchamahabhutas around you, and if you let them get degraded or polluted, then that will also show up in the microcosm. If you pollute the macrocosm, it will show up in the microcosm, which is the human body, which is also composed of these same Panchamahabhutas. And in Ayurveda, it is an imbalance between these that causes disease. So basically, they're saying if you do not take care of these elements and let them get polluted, your body will suffer disease. Now, this is remarkable considering this was written centuries ago, and at that time, they could not have had significant levels of pollution. And so this is not something they could have learned by experience, but it almost is a prescient saying describing this. Let's move on. So what else? Our technology and our solutions for modern living today have left us with huge amounts of stress and caused us several problems. What about our children? Are they doing okay? Teen depression statistics are shocking. 20% of American teens experience depression. Teenage is a time when everything's great. You're full of energy. Your whole life is before you. The world is full of opportunity. 20% of teens experiencing depression is really shocking. And although these are US statistics, there's a growing rate of depression and mental illness among Indian children as well, and pretty much everywhere in the world as we adopt the same technologies that worsen stress. Suicide, sadly, is the 3rd most common cause of death among youngsters. So this is typically what this sequence is typically what seems to be followed by the Western model. First, you hurry up and mess things up, and after that, so first you have doctors who are talking about smoking cigarettes, and then you put out warnings after millions of lives have been affected. You put out warnings talking about how this is not good for health. The same thing has happened with polluting the earth with plastic. Interestingly, they also find new solutions. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say new solutions, but time-tested solutions. This is the traditional Indian leaf plate, which is now sold, notice, for $36.99 online in eBay. So this is where finally solutions for the problems are found by going back to some traditional knowledge systems. So what does tomorrow's world need? We need a different mindset to find solutions. we don't need X plus delta X solutions where you have incremental additions to the, what has already caused you a problem, you just incrementally change it. That doesn't really do the job. One needs a completely new look at how these things are done. Now, access to textual knowledge is beyond modern books. So studying modern books does not give us access to that knowledge. For instance, the knowledge about how, water bodies should be taken care of. We need different mindsets. We need sustainable solutions. Most importantly, we need self-confidence to promote the right solutions. Even though we've had these solutions in our traditional knowledge systems, to be able to recognize and to state confidently that these are the right solutions takes confidence in our own heritage. And of course, our education system needs rethinking if we should solve these problems. Here are some solutions that the West has found. There's neem oil to be used as a pesticide. There's turmeric, curcumin for anti-inflammatory use. Similarly, there are all these other brands of things. One thing common to all of these you'll notice is that they all derive from Indian traditional knowledge. The other interesting thing is all of these are owned by the West. None of these are owned by India, where this knowledge came from. We must at present do our best to form a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes and opinions. I think many of you will recognize that this was Lord Macaulay's quote. And unfortunately, he was only too successful in what he set out to do, because we have effectively been cut off from our traditional knowledge by the Western system of schooling. Now, what are some of the issues with the system of schooling? First of all, there is a pressure to conform, and there's a lot of this seen here. Now, when we schooled in India, I schooled in India, and perhaps many of you did, we brought our own lunches, and the lunches might have been different, right? I mean, somebody brought rice, somebody brought roti, somebody brought something else, and that was fine. It was perfectly fine. One didn't feel, oh, because so-and-so brings roti, I need to bring roti. There was not that kind of pressure to conform. That was all accepted. But if you look at kids who go to school here, Indian kids who go to school in the US or in other Western countries, there is a lot of pressure to conform. They refuse to take our traditional lunches. In many cases, it's sandwich and pasta that are the accepted lunches. So this is just an example of the very representative of the pressure to conform. And that is ubiquitous in multiple fields. Similarly, there's a loss of symbols that represent one's identity. These are lost. And these are important for confidence, for rootedness in, and to be proud of one's heritage, where one comes from. They are also taught Western exceptionalism. The West is the provider of solutions for the entire world. This is really the message that the system of schooling gives. And when I'm saying Western system, this is true of schools in India also, which have, unfortunately, we have adopted this Western system. Critical thinking is taught, and this is good in that it teaches children to reason and to question. But when we are cut off from the knowledge that is part of our tradition, from those knowledge systems, then all that we are left with is a kind of faith without strong basis, and critical thinking then dents this system. And so, children are left with no moorings when the knowledge is denied to them. So the faith alone is, Shraddha or faith alone is not enough. Finally, the Western system of schooling, it eliminates all rasa. So when I'm talking of rasa, It's the beauty, the aesthetics, the appreciation, and I'll talk a little more about that later. But subjects are made very dry, and as I said, the aesthetics the value is lost. Okay, let's talk about, so then what are the blockers for us and our children to use their heritage, to the knowledge that comes from their heritage, to solve today's problems. First of all, there's a lack of training in techniques to train memory and focus. As you all might have heard, nowadays attention deficit disorder is almost like an epidemic. So children are not taught using techniques which traditionally were used to help them focus. There is a lack of access to the original knowledge because of the language barrier that has been introduced. Most of us really do not have good command over any of our Indian languages sufficient to read such original textbooks of Indian traditional knowledge systems. There's a lack of applied learning. There's a lot of rote learning in a sense of just learning things in theory. There's also a lack of a sense of history. We already talked about how there are many things we don't hear about in our history books. This leads to a loss of self-confidence overall and leads to a colonized mindset. And the typical remedial measures that people pursue focus on bhakti and sampradayas, going to the temple, doing pujas. Now, just that alone, for the reasons that we spoke about earlier, without the knowledge and the logic and the very hard reasoning behind many of these traditional knowledge systems, without that, just bhakti and sampradaya cannot hold ground against critical reasoning that is taught and should be taught in schools. So one of our great national leaders said, carried away by the flood of Western thought, we came to the conclusion, without weighing pros and cons, that we should give this kind of education to the people. This was Mahatma Gandhi who said this. And one of Dharampalji was a Gandhian who, inspired by this, actually did some very important research and wrote this book, The Beautiful Tree, which many of you might be aware of, which describes the indigenous Indian education system, pre-Macaulay. And this is a key work to tell us what the status of the education system was then. So here is a quote of an Englishman talking about how there is no country where the love of learning had so early an origin as in India. An educational survey by Adam, this is what Dharampalji's book talks about. I'll give you a couple of points from there. They had about 100,000 schools in Bengal and Bihar. So almost a school per village and more if the village was bigger. And the situation was the same for across Bombay, Madras, and Punjab presidency. So pretty much this was how the education system, we had an extensive system of schools all across the country. Now let's come back to, or let's talk about what the features of Indian education were. So first of all, it was a full-blown setup. As we saw, there were lots of schools. We also know about the ancient universities that existed. And also there were vocational training schools. So not all of them taught Shastra necessarily, but others taught about, vocations that were relevant to the students. And that had been going on for centuries. It had survived the test of time. Now, it has been over 200 years now that has been eliminated, thanks to Macaulay. That kind of teaching encouraged critical thinking. It had scientific rigor. It did teach STEM and logic, something we may not realize necessarily. And rasa is an is a very integral part of this teaching. So even a subject like science or mathematics is taught with rasa, and we'll see how a little later. And it is built with a higher goal for every shastra. So for instance, let's say you take grammar or you take mathematics. It was always about getting to excellence in that shastra, and to a point where you transcend that specific shastra and it becomes a spiritual pursuit. So this is how every shastra was pursued and how it was taught and learned. There was integrated and holistic learning. And of course, the symbols and of the arts of the culture were very much a part of this education. I'm just going to take this opportunity to show a video. This one is a video of children chanting from the Leelavati. This is a work in mathematics. And I'll explain what the shloka is in a little bit.
संख्यास्थानम् एकदशशतसहस्रायुधलक्षप्रयुतकोटयः क्रमशः अर्बुदमब्जम् खर्वनि महापद्मशङ्कवस्लस्मात् जलधिश्चान्त्यम् मध्यम् परार्धमिति दशगुणोत्तरम् संज्ञाः संख्यायाः स्थानानाम् व्यवहारार्थम् कृता पूर्वैः
संकलित व्यवकलिते कार्यक्रमादुत्क्रमतोऽथवाङ्कयोगो यथास्थानकमन्तरं वा गुणनम् गुण्यान्त्यमङ्कं गुणकेन हन्यादुत्सारितेनैवमुपान्त्यमादि गुण्यस्वधोधो गुणखण्डतुल्यः तैः सङ्गुणितो युतो वा भक्तो गुणशुद्ध्यतेन तेन लब्ध्या च गुण्यो गुणितः फलं वा द्विधा भवेत् रूपविभाग एवं स्थानैः पृथग्वा गुणितः समेतः इष्टो न युक्तेन गुणेन निग्धः अभीष्टग्न गुण्यान्वितवर्जितो वा.
Okay, let me just explain what that was. So the first one where the two little boys were chanting, that was a shloka that describes the place values. So the ones, the tens, the hundreds. So this shloka had about 10 places. So the interesting thing is, we have ones, tens, hundreds, and then you go to thousands and then 10,000s. You don't have a different name for that 10,000, but they do have, so Sahasra Ayuta, that's what it's called. And then there is Laksha, and then there is Prayuta and Koti. And you go on for everything, you have a different name. And this goes on for several digits. Now, there is no way you can forget this once you have learned this shloka as a child. Anytime in life, somebody comes up and asks you, what is 10 to the power of 10? You know it from this shloka. And not only that, it's such a beautiful way to learn it. The second part, the two girls were chanting. They were chanting the shlokas relevant to addition and subtraction. And then they said Gunanam. Gunanam is multiplication. So there was a much longer verse on Gunanam. Now, every line of that verse describes one method of doing multiplication. So there are 4 or 5 methods of multiplication described in that one verse. Same thing with other operations. There are often multiple ways of doing it that are described in these verses. So it's really a beautiful way. It's a very, we learn only one method usually of doing something in the Western education system. But here they really do a very detailed look at different techniques that can be used. So that is the Ganitam, Leelavati, an example of how rasa aesthetics is useful and used in Indian traditional systems to teach things like math. Let me go on with this presentation, and then I'll come back to a few more videos that I have. Let's talk about Indic languages. So why we teach in Agastya Gurukulam, we teach in Sanskrit. Sanskrit is our medium of teaching. Now, question is, why Indic languages? The Indic languages are far more structured, far fewer idiosyncrasies than English. Also, the way it's constructed, in Sanskrit, any word that you take, you can actually break it up to get to the root words. And with a set of several root words, the entire vocabulary is constructed, and it's done in a very scientific way. It's very, very, very interesting. And also the meanings conveyed also, relate to that. So for instance, the sun is called, Dinakara, right? And that's easily, you can break up and see why that's the sun is called so. The one who causes day, Dinakara, or Prabhakara, the one who gives light, who, creates light in this world. So, and every such word, these are easy ones, but there are, you can analyze words no end, and it's beautiful in how it has been created. You can't do a similar thing with all words of English. So also, as mentioned before, it's an unmatched storehouse of knowledge. There's poetry, there's philosophy, there is science, everything in these languages, especially Sanskrit, which perhaps holds the most of these. But all Indic languages have great works in these fields. And because they are so scientifically structured, these languages, it builds upon our ability to learn more languages. And this is something I think is quite evident. We Indians tend to be very adept at learning multiple languages. It's very common for people to know multiple languages, which is not necessarily true elsewhere. Because it's a very scientific way of thinking about language, it also is said to improve programming skills, our ability to learn programming as well. Of course, it builds self-confidence. Now, it's hard to explain. If you do a deep dive into Panini's grammar, it becomes self-evident as to how superior that system of grammar is compared to, for instance, English grammar, how comprehensive and superior it is. Now, that is hard to explain unless you have actually studied Paninian grammar. But I'll give you a very simple example that pretty much anyone can relate to if you know any Indian language. So the English alphabet is unidimensional. It goes in one sequence. Now, first of all, there is no rhyme or reason for this arrangement. It's just that we learn this by heart very early on in life. And so we don't forget it. But if you actually were trying to learn this and were looking for any pattern, there really isn't any. It's just almost a random arrangement. Now let's look at our Indian alphabets. So first of all, you start with the swaras. The swaras where you do not need the tongue to make contact with any part of the mouth. And then you go to the vyanjanas, and these are arranged neatly depending on where the tongue touches to produce these sounds. And these are multidimensional. So one is the rows represent where the tongue makes contact in the mouth. And the columns represent the aspirate or the non-aspirate character. Also, some other aspects of how the sound is produced. So the last column, for instance, is the nasal sounds. So here is actually how the aksharasthanas are described. Akuha visarjaniyanam kantha, which is from the throat comes the a, and then the ka varga, and a few others like ha. Similarly, the talu, which is the soft palate, produces e, the cha varga, ya, and sha, and so on. So for every letter in the alphabet, you have the description of where it comes from, and that's how it's arranged. So even with something as simple as the alphabet, you can see how scientific Sanskrit and its derived Indian languages are compared to English. Now let's talk about how we look at environmental science, for instance. So in the Western way, if we are learning about trees, one of the typical things we are taught is of what use are trees to us, right? So when we learn about trees, we are learning about trees from a human-centric viewpoint of what use are they to us. That is the main thing. Look at what this shloka from the Panchatantra says. Chaya supta mriga shakunta nivahair vishwa gwip lupta chadaha कीटैरावृत कोटरः कपिकुलैः स्कन्धे कृतप्रश्रयः विश्रब्धं मधुपैर्निपीतकुसुमः श्लाघ्यः स एव द्रुमः सर्वाङ्गैर्बहुसत्त्वसङ्गसुखदो भूभारभूतोपरः. So what it says is, in the shade, the deer and other animals sleep. The Shakunta birds sit on top of it and on the roof, and then in its hollows are many insects. Groups of monkeys play on its branches, and the bees, they buzz around the flowers and drink the nectar. And this is why this praiseworthy one, this is a tree. And then it says, it gives everyone, it gives them support, it gives them a lot. Now, others, other than the tree, other creatures are, it says bhubhara, their weights on this earth, or in other words, they don't carry their weight. It's the tree that carries the weight of all these creatures by giving them. And this is, first of all, the sentiment itself is so beautiful. The way it's described is so, again, poetry is so beautiful in here. And also the whole idea that the trees are the producers and all of us, humans included, are consumers. So the whole idea of how a tree is presented itself is quite different from what we are used to in our textbooks usually. Here's another reason to learn from the Shastras. These are the original. We've all heard about how so many of the mathematical discoveries were made in India and then went to other parts of the world. So as I already told you, there are multiple methods that are described in these Shastras to do various operations. The mathematics is very application oriented rather than theory. It is, again, as I said, Padya based, so poetic. And it also comes with a thread of dharma, with several other teachings also that go along with the mathematical teaching itself. So this was the verse about multiplication that you already heard. Now here's another example, very interesting. How do you explain infinity, the concept of infinity, to a kid? This is a beautiful verse that does that. Asmin vikara kaharena Rashavapi pravishteshvapi nisriteshu bahushvapi syat laya srishtikale anante achyute bhuta ganeshu yadvat. So basically, infinity is something from which if you take away or if you add to it, there is no change. And this is how the simile provided, like the great Lord Achyuta or Vishnu, just like all the creatures come out of him during creation and how they dissolve into him at the time of dissolution of the universe, but that neither diminishes him nor increases him. So the idea of dissolution, of creation, that is used to describe infinity, and it's a really beautiful way to describe it, that a child would be able to relate to if they're, if they have learned about the whole concept, the philosophy of dissolution and creation. So with that, I'll just talk a little bit about Agastya Gurukulam. It is an online Sanskrit medium school. In fact, it is the world's first online Sanskrit medium school. Agastya is a non-profit or an NGO that provides Shastra-based education, and as I mentioned, in Sanskrit medium. Classes are held in all subjects. You saw some of the chanting in mathematics, but I'll also show you some classes in mathematics. We also teach science, social studies, so specifically decolonized history, and bringing to light some of these, unmentioned heroes from our past. Of course, we do teach Sanskritam itself. We also teach English as well as a mother tongue, and we have both full-time and part-time programs. Let me show you some mathematics teaching video.
मम प्राप्तं
तदेव सम्यक्
पृष्ठतः उत्तरं दर्शयतु।
पृष्ठतः अहं न लिखितवान् खलु, अहम् एतत् सर्वं मार्जयित्वा अत्र लिखितवान्। इदानीम् अहं सर्वे सावधानेन पश्यन्तु, अहम् एकम् अद्भुतं प्रकारं प्रदर्शयामि अत्र। इदानीम् अहम् एतत् प्रश्नम् इष्टयुग्गुणनेन करोमि। पश्यन्तु कथं करोमि इति। अहम् एतस्य उत्तरं जानामि खलु। एतस्य उत्तरं जानामि। अस्माकं प्रश्नः एषः खलु। अस्माकं प्रश्नः एषः। इदानीम् अत्र पश्यन्तु 107 प्लस 93 किमस्ति? इदानीं 200 इत्यनेन गुणनं करोतु, किं प्राप्नुवन्ति? 100 अनेन कृत्वा एतत् प्राप्तवन्तः खलु। 100 अनेन कृत्वा 2574.
Okay, so that was just an example of how they were learning in maths class. In fact, this was one of the methods of multiplication. Ishtayuggunanam is one of the, I think, 5 methods of multiplication that they learn. Actually, this was a video that recently went viral on social media.
कति अंशः तत्र अंतरं भवति? सूर्यचन्द्रयोः अंतरं कति भवति? 12 डिग्री भवति। तदा किं भवति? प्रतिपत्। एवमेव चन्द्रः द्वितीयदिने अत्र आगच्छति। तदनन्तरं किं भवति? किञ्चित् अंतरम् अधिकं भवति खलु। किं भवति? 12 डिग्री अंतरं भवति।
Jyotisham, which people often think of as astrology, but Jyotisham covers the study of astronomy also. So it's not just astrology, it covers astronomy too. So, in fact, that's the major part of it, and that's what they're learning here. So, Agastya Gurukulam intends to make children fluent in Sanskritam, so they are able to access the entire Bharatiya traditional knowledge systems, the corpus of that, as appropriate or as relevant to whatever future field they decide to work in. And we believe that through rigorous study of Shastric works and modern subjects, that it leads to greater intellectual development, and that we will be able to nurture thought leaders who are firmly moored in values that teach us to live in harmony with the world around us. And memorization is a really important part of early learning. This is what Bharatiya Shiksha Paddhati was about. You start with memorization, and then little older children are taught logic, and later on, perhaps in high school, they learn rhetoric. So we follow a similar evolution in our curriculum. Early on, there's a lot of memorization in all subjects. So as you saw, even in mathematics, there is memorization. Same with Sanskrit itself.
नमः अहम् आदिदेवः अगस्त्यगुरुकुले द्वितीयवर्गस्य छात्रः। अद्य अहं चतुष्कोणसमखातः क्यूबॉइड घनः क्यूब सूची पिरामिड दण्डगोलः सिलिण्डर विषये किञ्चित् वदामि। एतत् किमस्ति? एतत् घनः अस्ति। एषः मुखः, एषा धारा, एषः कोणः। घनस्य षड्मुखाः भवन्ति। 1 2 3 4 5 6 12 धाराः भवन्ति। 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 अष्टकोणाः अपि भवन्ति। 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 एतत् किमस्ति? एतत् चतुष्कं 2.
All right. So I told you the story about Raja Bhoja, right? So Raja Bhoja established his capital. It was called Dhara Nagari. And about Dhara, it is said the specialty was that every resident of this city was learned, was not just minimally educated, but actually was a learned person, highly educated. And this included people who did, the laborers. This included people who did menial jobs. At every stage of society, they were said to be learned. Dhara Nagari today is the city of Adhar, and that the remnants of the Dhara of those days are dilapidated at this time. And this is true with our education system too, with our traditional education system. It needs to be rebuilt and restored to its original greatness. And that is what we are making a small effort towards in Agastya Gurukulam.
Namaste, Archana ji. It was a beautiful presentation. Thank you. I wanted to ask about one of your slides where you mentioned something about how they used to incorporate dharmic teachings in Ganit. Is it possible for you to give some sort of an idea for people who don't know how that was done?
So as I was mentioning, right, if you look at our traditional works and all the, whichever field there was the masters of knowledge, the uniform, or let's say the common theme is that all striving for excellence is a part of one's spiritual, shall we say, it's all an offering to the divine. It's a part of one's spiritual journey. So it doesn't matter if you're an expert in Vyakarana or you're an expert in Ganitam. So just let's take, in the modern day, if you take a cell, just a simple cell, right? And you really want to understand everything about a cell, right? Even something as small as a cell. It would take a lifetime, and even then you probably won't understand everything about it, right? But the quest, when you go on that quest, you actually transcend what just that immediate goal is, and it leads you to a higher plane of thought, of evolution spiritually. And that is what underlies all of these great masters' works. So for instance, in Leelavati, the first shloka starts, it's a prayer. So it starts with a prayer. And then, and you can see, for instance, when you're teaching about infinity, the example given. So everything is full of this. And same way when you have a mathematical problem, right? So for instance, you may have a problem where you're looking at arithmetic or geometric sequences, and you might say you have 5 pairs of cow and bullock pairs, 5 of them, and each of them will have a calf in so much time, and after so long, how many cattle will you have? Problems like this, which are all about the really they're very interesting, and or you'll have about monkeys playing on a tree, and you'll have a problem describing that and asking you a question at the end of it. But even the description is beautiful. Sorry, I digressed from not just talking about the spiritual part, but also to talking about the symbolism and the beauty in it. But similarly, there are other, examples of problems where you would bring in. So for instance, let me give you some other examples that have been set for our students in their tests and exams. So for instance, one related to the common idea of, work over time. So this was set as to build the Rama Setu, right? So many kapis had to work for so long, or this is how many miles they were able to build each day. And the total length of the Rama Setu was this much. And these were the number of kapis you had on each day. How long would it take to build it, right? So variations of things like this. So many such, another question that I remember was about the number of steps to climb the Tirupati hill, Tirumala, right? So you that again gives you for when you are giving problems on speed, on distance covered. So these are examples of how these ideas are woven into the mathematics too.
Namaste, Archana ji. Thank you so much for this valuable presentation. I have 2 questions. My first question is regarding the textbook and curricula you've prepared. Is it possible to know the textbooks you use in each subject for all grade levels? In addition to that, the second question is about our students who are from a lower economic situation, or people who are unable to afford education of a homeschooling. Do they get opportunities in way of scholarships with Agastya Gurukulam as well? Thank you so much.
So for the first question regarding textbooks, so curriculum development has been a major task, and we are still working on that. So for some of our classes, we still don't have actual textbooks. We work on, individual lessons that have been prepared by our teachers. But we are in the process. So for instance, we are developing textbooks for mathematics in collaboration with experts from IIT Bombay, specifically Professor Ramasubramanian's team. So these textbooks are going to come out hopefully before too long. And once they're out, others will be able to use them too. So that is about the mathematics curriculum development. Similarly, we have not been able to find good Itihasa curriculum at the school level that is decolonized. So we are again working on creating our own curriculum, and hopefully we will also have textbooks for that sometime. The same is with science. So all of these we are working on creating. So that's about the curriculum and textbooks. Our intention is once we have the textbooks that we make it available to all to use for anybody who's interested in using such curriculum. Coming now to the other question. So, we believe in the traditional idea that one must never sell Vidya. Vidya can only be given. It should not be, so money should never be a reason to not be able to get Vidya. For that reason, we take anybody, irrespective of their amount, of their ability to pay the amount of fees, in the sense of, we provide them, we get donations to support their cost of education. We have not ever turned away anybody who wanted to study with us for financial reasons.
Thank you, Archana ji, for the previous answer. I was wondering whether in our Shiksha Paddhati previously or in your Gurukulam currently, whether you guys also teach and train kids how to develop a sense of self-reflection, self-awareness, getting to know oneself, going into the subtler dimensions, where you can apply yourself from a deeper level rather than kind of upwardly, because that might also give them insight into their emotions, how they themselves function. I feel that's an area completely ignored in the Western system. There's a certain sense of condescension in the Western system about the emotions. It's all rational, intellectual, cognitive. And then eventually they end up going to therapy all. So it's actually so skewed. I wondered what's there in our Shiksha Paddhati and what do you teach regarding the awareness aspect and emotions?
You're absolutely right. So that was part of it. Maybe I, did not stress on that aspect, but that is when I was mentioning the ADHD, the inability to focus, that's part of the same problem where, reflection, being comfortable with oneself is something that children don't learn in the Western system often. So every day in our Gurukulam, children do either yoga or Kalaripayattu. So they are both of these, and especially so yoga, as you are aware, allows focus and internal reflection. Of course, it takes children some time to learn to do that, but it's a process that has to be learned. And we do that, do regular yoga. One thing I did not mention is that you would have noticed that some of the teaching videos showed Zoom sessions. So that was the online teaching. But you also would have noticed that some of those involved children sitting, in fact, in a thatched structure with a guru and learning. So those were taken during our camps. We hold twice a year camps typically when logistics permit that, because children who are learning online need a chance to do in-person learning, to meet their classmates, meet their teachers. And our camps are a huge, I would say it's like a really big, intensive learning experience. And during these camps, again, they do yoga every day. So that is our main way to teach them to focus. Of course, learning many of these, chanting itself helps some degree of focus, but to that we add yoga too.
I wondered, since you are running that institution and you mentioned about kids learning online, you showed a video as well. I was just curious to know, when you're imparting our type of education through online learning, how do kids of different age groups interact with that? Because there's a lot of discussion about the only way education can be given is with physical presence of teachers and students. No doubt, I understand the benefits and essentiality of that. But I feel it's a manner of how they engage. If they've been given the right kind of practices, kids can engage amazingly even online. That's just my personal view. But I wanted to understand from someone who's involved in such institutions, what's your experience about what are the hindrances, pros and cons of that online learning when they're learning our education?
Yeah. So actually online learning, works pretty well, much better than what one would have thought before we tried it. So children do learn. Of course, the age matters. It's not as good as in person. In person has a lot of advantages. But online learning definitely still works. You heard the kids talking, you heard how they were responding in class. Sometimes kids, especially at younger ages, it's a little challenging, but as the kids get a little older and they get absorbed in classes, they do very well with online learning. So that has been our experience. Parents do need to get involved. So especially with the younger kids, but even with the older kids, parents need to keep an eye on them typically, if they're sort of middle school age kids. But as they get little, to the older classes, then they get more serious on their own. With little kids, parents, as long as parents sit with them, then they'll sit and listen. But otherwise, it's a little challenging. They want to, they lose attention very fast. But even, we are even teaching kids as young as 4 years old, although not for prolonged periods. We do half our classes for such young children. And those are, based on Sanskrit songs and learning numbers and letters. Children with a parent sitting next to them, they do quite well. It's mainly they need the parental attention.
I have been following Agastya Gurukulam since inception, and my child is learning in Gurukulam. He's 4-year-old, and I have nothing but amazing reviews for Agastya Gurukulam. But as I see him going into homeschool stages, I am strongly considering homeschool for him. And I want to understand what is the commitment that the parent needs at that stage. That you said we need to be involved. But if our lack of Sanskrit knowledge and our lack of knowledge in most of the subjects that we missed out during our own learning phases, how are we able to, as parents, how can we help kids through that? And how far into homeschooling can I say that, my child is being shaped to a proper, career that he could pick up as he grows, and also conforming to the standards that other kids are learning outside. Any insights that you could offer, would appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think your first question was how much involvement is needed from parents, considering we ourselves have been denied this education, right? So, at Agastya, we say if you want to put your child in Agastya, it's a journey for the whole family. All of you will learn. And you have to be ready to learn and willing and happy to learn. For most of our families, they have all been happy to learn themselves as well. So for a few years, you you will need to also keep up with what they're learning and to help them learn. But then you'll get to a point where they get ahead of you. And then your job is more to make sure that they're not distracted by other things and they're focusing on their work rather than actually teaching them the content. So I would say, by depending on your level of knowledge, of course, but, first, second grade, you would probably be teaching them, learning yourself and teaching them. But maybe by about fourth grade or so, they're starting to learn faster than you can keep up. And after that, I think you kind of have to say, okay, they know more in Sanskrit than I do, but you still, you're still there to, for instance, with mathematics or with science, that knowledge we always have, even though they're learning it in Sanskrit, to teach them the reasoning, the concepts, the fundamentals. So you have to put in time, more early classes, because children won't sit by themselves. But later it reduces. So if you're working, I would say it's very hard if you're doing first and second grade, and if you're working too, if both parents are working, that's very challenging, unless you have, a grandparent who will sit with the child. I think that's really important. Then again, depending on the child, by third or fourth grade, you can, leave them for short periods, but you still have to be around and help them with their work. So this is the reason why at this time, Agastya Gurukulam only extends till the 8th grade. So 1st to 8th grade. These are the years where you really can allow the child to explore and learn, and you can also explore without too much penalty, because the real serious learning only sets in after that. So, from 9th grade onwards is where you got to start worrying about board exams, and then eventually about entrance into universities. So up to about 8th standard, you can, you don't have to be very worried about whether you're covering everything that's being covered in the outside curriculum. Now, for a child who's in India, enrolled in Agastya Gurukulam, we would be covering pretty much everything that they should be learning in regular school, or something very comparable. If you're in the US or in another country, our social sciences, those deal more with India. So this is why if you're in the US, for instance, you may not learn the US history or your state history that you otherwise would have if your child went to a regular school. But that is not at all something that is really a big deal, because whatever is really needed for the long term is covered very well in high school. So the child will do perfectly fine picking this up in high school. So we don't think that there is any issue with not covering that in the earlier classes.